Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about critical theory and the citizen architect. Today on the show, I am joined by Milton S. Curry. Milton is currently the Dean and Professor at the University of Southern California School of Architecture, positions he's held since 2017. Previously, he held administrative and academic positions in architecture programs across the country, including University of Michigan Taubman School of Architecture and Urban Planning, Harvard GSD, Cornell University, and Arizona State. He's also worked as an architect in a variety of studios and has a long commitment to publishing and scholarship and public discourse around architecture. He co-founded and edited two academic journals, Critical Productive and Appendix, and has written for a variety of publications. I first came across Milton's work actually in the first issue of Deem Journal. You remember I had the editors on the show at the end of last year and really loved his interview in that issue and wanted to have him on the show to talk about his commitment to writing around architecture, design, and culture. So in this episode, we talk about that. We talk about his early interest in design and history and how that shaped his understanding of critical theory. We talk about the idea of the citizen architect and how architects and designers can reclaim ideas around design thinking and have a truly positive impact on the world. And we talk about why design students can't check their identity at the door and why they should and need to bring their lived experiences into the design discourse and profession. It's a fascinating conversation. It covers a lot. I really learned a lot from this and admire how he thinks about being a designer today. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. I'm also really excited to announce that Scratching the Surface has relaunched our membership program. It's now on Patreon. For the last 3 years, this show has been supported entirely through listener support, and we're making it even easier for you to help sustain the show. We're offering 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and then $10 for super fans, that give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, transcripts, and exclusive interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, I hope you consider joining our new membership program over on Patreon. Your support truly means so much to me. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here is my conversation with Milton Curry. I want to start in perhaps a kind of peculiar and specific place. As I was preparing for this and thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about, I came across another interview that you had done where you mentioned that as a child, you were very interested in design from a young age, and you were actually really interested in graphic design originally. And I would like to talk about that a little bit. Where did your interest in design come from, and what was it about graphic design that immediately kind of caught your interest?
I think I pinpoint it to kind of, I don't know, second, third, fourth grade, where the interest was. I've always had an interest in writing and kind of that form of expression, but also design. And I used to spend a lot of time designing the covers of reports and things, spending proportionately less time writing because I think I was better at that or could do that, well and satisfactorily. But I really got into kind of designing, the cover of these reports, whether it was on foreign country or something else.
Mm-hmm.
The other aspect of that is my parents. My mother went to school with the wife of a black astronaut, and Ed Dwight, who ended up coming out of the Kennedy space program, not going to space, but actually becoming an artist, becoming a sculptor. And so I was exposed to his art making, and he was very encouraging of me to sketch and to draw more traditional kind of drawing, portrait drawing, things like that. And so I think it's drawing and graphic design that were attractive to me. And then as I traveled with my parents, my dad was a doctor, and as we traveled to medical conferences and would stay at different hotels, we stayed at a lot of John Portman designed hotels, and I would do a lot of sketching of those hotels and were very intrigued with them when I was growing up. So it all kind of came together. I was subscribed. I subscribed to Architectural Record, I think, in uh, ninth or 10th grade, and so I would get all those issues and just see what was happening in the design fields. And I was as interested in interiors as I was the architecture. So just a very curious mind, kind of at that point, looking at kind of the world from my room in Central California.
Yeah, it's so funny. My childhood was very similar, and I very early on was interested in kind of design related things. I didn't have the word design, I didn't grow up around designers or that design was a term, but um, fell into drawing. Like you, designed the cover of school projects and things like that. I subscribed to not Architectural Record. Is that the one that you said? Architectural Record you subscribed to in 10th
I
grade?
think record at some point digest as well, even though I
Yeah.
now find it a bit quite garish.
I was gonna say I subscribed to Architectural Digest. I think I was in 8th or ninth grade at the time, and read it every month when it arrived. So even though we are from different parts of the country, different generations, I totally know what you're talking about. Where when did architecture specifically then become kind of the vessel, I guess, for all of this curiosity? Was that when you were kind of planning on college?
Well, no, actually, that came quite early as well.
Hmm.
Probably around fifth grade, I was told by my fifth grade teacher that I'd never become an architect because I wasn't good at math. This is at fifth grade, and so I said, "Well, thanks for your opinion. That's very interesting." But I think it was around that time, fifth or sixth grade. Became interested in kind of two things: architecture and um, being a brain surgeon.
Hmm.
So the connection is just precision, specificity, order, and I think I've always been very organized and kind of see the world that way. And so I think that was the kind of connection. My dad was a doctor as well. Um, but as I got into ninth and 10th grade in those areas, I mean, I began to be very attracted to the art courses and
Mhm.
drafting courses, which were very, very detailed exercises that you found that you had in those courses. And all of that kind of came together to begin to think about architecture as something that could be very creative and also, something that could be very impactful to larger communities and
Mhm.
people. And so it became, I think it started with something very, for me, it was very insulated or interior. And then around high school, I was also very attracted to history courses, things like that. Became something that came really more out of the kind of insularity of thought to something that well, this is something that actually has these qualities that really extend to larger communities, and the impacts of architecture is not just the kind of satisfaction, the aesthetic satisfaction of having created something, but actually there's something more there.
Yeah, I want to come back to that idea actually, but just to follow this thread, and I promise we won't just kind of go through your whole background in order. But it's interesting to me that you talk about in high school you were drawn to the kind of art classes and the drafting classes, but you were also interested in the history classes. And what struck me in reading about you and thinking about this conversation is it seems from the beginning you had this kind of parallel interest in both the practice of architecture, the actual kind of designing of buildings, but also this kind of critical theory side, this reading side, this theory side. You started your first academic journal while you were a student at Harvard, is that right?
Yeah, before the end of my last semester as a graduate student at Harvard, I started Appendix Journal with
Right.
two other persons. One who was in the same class as me at Harvard, the Master of Architecture post professional program, and then another individual who was teaching at Harvard, who had done his master's
I
at
see.
Harvard, but he was also doing his PhD at Harvard.
Can you talk a little bit more about kind of where those two interests, that kind of the writing, the kind of intellectual side, the history, intersected for you with architecture, and then the kind of uh, I don't know the word, the drive or the desire to start this journal while you're a graduate student. What was what were you kind of wanting to achieve with that, or what kind of dialogues did you want to have that you felt like you could do through this forum that you maybe weren't getting otherwise?
Well, maybe to be a little bit biographical to kind of frame the
Yeah.
answer to that question. I grew up as essentially an upper middle class home in Central Valley in Fresno, California. My dad was a doctor, a family physician, and my mom was a housewife for most of my childhood, and then became a community activist and
Mm.
a community organizer, and then became the first Black person elected to the school board in Fresno, California.
Mm.
My On my father's side, I had an uncle who was president of Bishop College, which was a Black college that
Mhm.
he moved from Marshall, Texas, to Dallas, Texas, and built into a very successful college, Black college, and he became president of the United Negro College Fund during, I believe, straddled the Ford and Carter
Mm.
administration.
Mm.
Um, and he's someone who got his PhD in theoretical math, which must have been in the early 1900s. And
Wow.
so he was influential, as were my parents, as role models. And I'm named after him. My first name is Milton, from my uncle Milton King Curry, who was president of Bishop College and president of the United Negro College Fund. And my middle initials, S and F, Sandy Frederick, are from Sandy Frederick Ray, who was my godfather and who was Martin Luther King's roommate at Morehouse College.
Oh,
My
wow.
uncle Milton also went to Morehouse College, as did all of my uncles on my dad's side went to Morehouse College. So, and my godfather, Sandy Frederick Ray, spoke at Dr. Martin Luther King Sr.'s wife's funeral. So Martin Luther King's mother's funeral.
Hmm.
Sandy F. Ray spoke at that. So I think that looking back, the idea of service, the idea of activism, the idea of social equity and commitments to that were really ingrained in my family from the start. I did
Hmm.
grow up in a upper middle class household, but we actually lived in a working class Black community. That's where my dad's patients were.
Mm.
And so, and then my mom became a community organizer and fought for um, equal treatment during the desegregation program, the forced busing program. I lived through all of those years as a student in the public school system, but also as the son of someone whose mother was out in the streets and on the
Yeah.
news many nights of the week in those battles. So that's where I come from, and so I think it in the end it kind of feels natural to be in a position where that we found ourselves in at Harvard, where I went to grad school, where there was virtually no representation of Black
Hmm.
thought in academic journals, and there was very little um, interest in it, seemingly. And we wanted to break through that and wanted to, bring other people into conversations that were not being had. And we were met with quite a bit of resistance, I have to say.
Mm.
But it was a very successful and educational endeavor, and I think very proud of that effort. I think it's looking back, it was historic in many ways. So it came out of, at least for me, and I think for the other co-editors, came out of a notion that also around that time in the early 90s. We were seeing the emergence of a real articulation of Black thought and of uh, the thought of Latinx persons and indigenous persons and notions of identity being brought to the fore within the academic construct. We're seeing that in other disciplines like art history and cultural theory and English departments, but we weren't seeing that in architecture schools, uh, uh, either amongst design studio faculty nor amongst history and theory faculty. And I think that presented a gap and a challenge, and that's what we were trying to meet.
I I have a question that I'm gonna try to connect it. Like, I have like a couple big ideas that I want to try to connect into a coherent question for you, because I think I'm curious about this kind of relationship that you were seeing while you were a student, and even kind of in the early part of your career, between kind of race and architecture, or race in the built environment. And a subject that comes up on this podcast all the time is that design is a type of ideology made artifact. It takes, ways of seeing the world, points of view, opinions, and it solidifies them in many ways, and then shapes how we relate to the environment. And architecture obviously is the best example of that. The way a building can give credence to an idea or serve a certain community, or the way roads are built to separate or to displace people. And I'm interested. You said uh, that there was not a lot of interest in kind of Black voices and diverse voices in architecture at the time. How did you kind of find a way in to how did you find a way to kind of make those discussions heard? Because you're right, this was a kind of historical journal. There weren't people talking about this. Um, do you know what I'm trying to say? Like what were the kind of conversations that were happening, and how did you kind of find a way to bring in the things you were interested in? Do you know what I mean?
I think so. In a way, there's a lot of self education that had to happen. And I credit influential mentors and professors along the way. Val Wark at Cornell was very influential in terms of being able to think outside of the notion of typology to think about genre. Um, and reading people like Anthony Vidler and the notion of the uncanny. I mean, these were elements that were part of, I think, a kind of self-education of trying to, in a way, unlearn
Right.
some of the conventional ways that architecture is being discussed, and how the discourse, particularly around architectural theory, was being put forth, and how the discourses of cultural theory and you know signifying monkey Henry Louis Gates and bell hooks and
Mm-hmm.
Cornell West and all the figures that were being inventive and innovative in that discourse around race and 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 thinking, and how that evolved in other disciplines. So it was a bit of self-education, of taking courses, of um, relying on things that thoughts that had emerged out of other courses that weren't directly related to race, but that you could use methodologies to begin to think anew
Right.
about race. So the genre, the idea of thinking about race through notions of genre, or thinking about gentrification through ideas of tourism, of how we see others and otherness within the context of our experiences through a city. So it's kind of pulling these threads in a way of developing a kind of self education. So in that way, we saw people at Cornell West lecture at Harvard, which was very interesting. I was, had the opportunity to listen to that live,
Mm,
and so there were people coming a little bit over to our area in
yeah.
architecture, and but not really with the knowledge and the history and the historical and theoretical context to think it through. So I think it was started without the journal was started with a series of questions more than proclamations and imperatives, and I think
Mm,
we tried to use the the people who we invited to submit work and the work that we published, we tried to use that as a way of thinking through these issues, thinking through feminism in the face of racial disparities in who was actually benefiting from feminism, for example. Thinking about sexuality in space, the work that had been done by Beatrice Colomina, the canonical volume there, and wanting to engage it and wanting to advocate for that, but yet not seeing Black women represented there in a way that was valued. And so I think it was taken, and I think so often, even today, we're dealing with these issues is taken often as a as a resistance to how these discourses are proceeding in some cases without people of color.
Mm-hmm.
But it actually is wanting, an invitation to have a conversation. And
Right.
I think that that was, it was surprising to me that a discipline that likes robust debate and wants uh, uh, conversations and critiques and reviews are always very fraught with tensions and
Mm-hmm.
people at each other's throats, and that's in some ways a very good thing. But I was surprised at some of the resistance that we had when we did come out, because it really was an invitation for conversations.
It's interesting to me, and we don't have to stay like for this question, we don't have to stay in appendix and kind of in your time at Harvard, but maybe extrapolate out to, that discourse generally over the course of your career. I am as guilty as anyone of being interested in the conversation, interested in the ideas, interested in the theories. Sometimes at the detriment of the actual practice, of the detriment of like how this stuff actually manifests itself. And I'm not saying that there's a separation there, or that those are different, but I'm interested in your perspective. How did that interest in the conversation, in those questions, has that changed how you think about the role of the architect, of how design actually functions in the world, or kind of what that means to be a designer and an architect?
Yes, but I think just to kind of scroll forward in time to where we are
Mhm.
today, and when I came to the University of Southern California to be dean of the School of Architecture, um, kind of again without knowing, put into a inaugural speech the idea of citizen architect. It's not the first. I'm not the first person to use it, and I didn't never claim that, but I was trying to define it anew and to
Mhm.
define it in a new way, and that um, has in some ways become a framing mechanism for how we think about where we're going as a school. And I guess the way I would answer your question is, before we talk about the role of the architect, we have to talk about the role of the human and the role of the person. And I think for far too long we've thought about architects as kind of siloed, in which their professional identity is siloed from their personal identity. And one of the things that I said when I came here is, and I say it to freshman students, you go to the airport and you check your bags, and you get on the plane, then you get off the plane at your destination, you go to baggage claim, you pick up your bags. That's the way I felt architecture school was. Drop your identity at the door, assimilate, and then pick it up when you do your thesis,
Right.
and be who you are. And I think that's just so antithetical to where we want architects to be and how we want them to be confident in their voice, and also to be authentic in the ways in which they're pursuing aesthetics, to development, to equitable use of environment and climate, etc. So I think it's very important to put those two things back together. If
Mhm.
you're not a good person, you're not a good architect.
Right.
So I
Right.
think we have to start with, no, don't check your identity at the door. Bring it, and let's confront your identity, or what you perceive it to be, and how it's evolving. Let's bring that into conversations in studios, in seminars, so that you don't think like I've got to be in a closet for 4 years while I absorb and assimilate what architecture has been over the history, over the course of history, and then I can rediscover who I am, when I do a thesis and graduate. So I think that's kind of where I am today. Is that the architect has to be part of society and has to see themselves not as outside of that, even though they're working for a client. I think the client architect relationship is evolving, and I think it needs to evolve. And clients are, um, clients are communities. Clients are the larger kind of polity of a city, particularly if you're doing urban development work. And so
Mhm.
that's the perspective. I think when you get into the specific issues of aesthetics and the kind of work that we need. Do we need single family? Do we need multifamily? I mean, some of these are political and policy questions, but I think it starts with a multidisciplinary perspective on how your role as an architect is complicitous with
Right.
things that you may or may not want it to be complicitous with. And it's also impactful in ways that you might not appreciate its impact on communities and people.
I would love to hear you talk more about what that looks like in an educational setting, because and the reason I ask that is because I think about the same things in regards to graphic design. And I think there's a long graphic design history that kind of sets up these hierarchies about this is what good graphic design looks like. These are the rules of graphic design, and many of those rules and many of those ideas of what we call good graphic design are actually a very narrow set of theories from some white European men in the mid-century, that we're still kind of propagating that aesthetic, and that is what the designer does. The graphic designer is neutral. You are communicating you are designing for somebody else's message, and I think that's starting to change in graphic design, and we're starting to kind of see that is a limited view and doesn't always work, or maybe often doesn't work at all anymore. But I see this tension in the schools that I teach in, and even in my own kind of teaching practice about, um, how do you teach history and these theories, and and show them the trajectory, show them the history that they are entering into, or one of the histories they are entering into, while also teaching them these are the things that you need to know as a designer to get a job, whether that's technology or certain skills, with this idea of the individual, with this idea of kind of who you are, your own identity, and how all those things fit together. I find I want to find a way to have those kind of fit together into a really harmonious way, and I don't know how to do that. I'm curious how you think about that kind of blending this. This is what you need to know to be an architect, but also here's how to start thinking about bringing your own identity into this, and here's thinking about history, but not the only history. You know what I mean?
Sure, I think. Look, I think the way architecture schools, the way professional degree programs are organized is through a series of um, design studios and then courses that kind of split uh, between areas that have to do with technology and history and theory and site and climate and so forth. And those requirements have adjusted over time. Um, I think that from my perspective as a dean, as an educator, I think we have to put more pressure on those courses, and I think historically there has been maybe an opportunity for more um, challenging and um, challenging theoretical ideas to come through the silo of architectural theory, where history is seen as a kind of just the facts, and then structures is seen as, again, just it's just science, and then design studio is kind of somewhat open, but hewing closely to certain typologies and ways of making buildings, et cetera, et cetera. I think we need to put pressure on all of those aspects of the educational, all those pieces that go into the educational fabric for students, and that's what we're hearing from students directly. Structures is not structures and technology is not um, innately nascent of bias, and
Right.
neither is history or theory or design typology. So I think the interdisciplinarity of how we pursue architecture is very important to how we think about architecture as professionals. And we have to be very sober minded about the kind of situations that we are facing in our society. We're in a neoliberal, late capitalist situation where the idea of egalitarianism, as we conceptualize it, even as John Rawls idealized it, is not available. It's
Right.
simply not available in this environment, no matter what kind of philanthropy you throw at it. And so that's a reality. White supremacy, as we've seen in the last week, months, years, is a reality.
Mm-hmm.
Racism is a reality. And I think the longer that we in architecture schools kind of have built the bubble to where these are marginal to the
Right.
core enterprise of architecture capital A, I think we've become more and more irrelevant to how to help from our perspective to innovate and in some cases solve to some of those intrinsic and entrenched societal issues. I see it as an opportunity. Again, the resistance and the energy of social movements present interesting, challenging, but also potentially provocative and inspiring opportunities to actually create something with people that may not look like you. That's exciting, and I think if we can build on the excitement of that versus the tension that is almost habitual that we feel when these issues are brought up, I think we can be in a very different place. I think we have to be in a very different place.
And you've talked about before how architects and architectural thinking has kind of taken a back seat to this kind of codified design thinking that purports to solve or attempt to solve many of these things that we're talking about, but often does not, is often a band-aid or often just a kind of a visual rebrand in many ways. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the limits of what you see as kind of the limits of quote unquote design thinking and how the architect can maybe not not reclaim that, but start to be a part of that conversation again?
Well, I think the problem starts with how discourses become so complicit with the market and market capitalism that they become complicit with the most negative aspects of that. And I think um, when I talk about architecture thinking, and I talk with students and faculty about the idea of what is it to be an architectural thinker, it is to first and foremost um, allow yourself the imagination to go beyond the notion of a market context. And so,
Right.
if the imperative is to provide a public benefit, whether it be a promenade or a public park or housing, if you're already constrained by the notion of the market dynamics, you're never going to imagine anything outside of that. And I think
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
the problem with design thinking is that it colonizes every thought to be in service of generating a product or a solution to a problem, the problem which may have emerged through market-based thinking that crowds out notions of egalitarianism, for example. So you take the problem as a given, and then you determine or think through a solution based on a kind of notion of the indomitable spirit of entrepreneurism to solve every problem and to to do it within a market based context. I choose to use architecture thinking as a way to get outside of the constraints of the market-based context, the neoliberal context. And I think that provides um, the possibility of thinking anew, not only about solutions but also about problems. And I think a symptom of that, or symptom of the negative aspects of design thinking, is also smart cities. I think that um, it's interesting to think about that term. And again, I'm not saying I'm against technology. I'm not. But when you think about how cities have been uh, uh, cities have been essentially engineered in this late capitalist context in our country, to be bereft of the resources to actually do what they need to do to execute the egalitarian vision of a city, of a polity. And therefore, privatization has to take hold. And then privatization gives way to efficiency and models of experts and so forth. And the average citizen gets marginalized in that process. And so, within that context, to talk about smart cities, to me, is not as productive as talking about smart citizens. And I think when you have a smart citizenry, you then have a more informed and robust uh, uh, debate, conversation, relationship with government, and also with other entities that are supporting the role of government, and also supporting the role of bottom up investments, time, money, and intellectual investments that communities are making on their own to make things better. I was associate dean at University of Michigan and did a lot of work on behalf of our university and our school, School of Architecture and Urban Planning in Detroit. And the lessons that I learned there was that democracy, this is in 2010 to 2017, that democracy is very fragile. I saw Detroit and other cities decimated by emergency managers appointed by the governor with no responsibility to the citizens whatsoever. And they ran ramshot over the citizens of the cities that had those emergency managers. The fraudulent bankruptcy of Detroit was also a casualty of that. And where a democracy is threatened, you have corruption and all kind of nefarious practices step in. And so I think, uh, you know, maybe it's my experience in Detroit that, when you talk about design thinking in smart cities,
Yeah.
I mean, my God, when you decimate a city that can't even pay for electricity and bus service to get kids from their home to school, what does it mean to talk about a smart city? What does
Right.
it mean to talk about design thinking as helping a community solve a problem? It's great that community gets more involved. It's great that you might plant a community garden, but that's marginal to the widespread thievery that essentially robbed them of an equivalent framework to live and to raise their kids as other communities, even those with other races that are living within the same municipality.
I'm interested in how architects and this idea of architectural thinking, and I think, maybe we don't even need to limit this to strictly architectural designers, but any type of designer. How do you have thoughts on how they can actually be a part of that conversation again? So much of these types of conversations that we're talking about, and even the one that we're having now, and even going back to the journals that you've edited, so much of that can sometimes be insular, can be designers talking to other designers, architects talking to other architects. And you're right, it is about kind of re-engaging with our role as humans and re-engaging with the citizen. How do we start to turn some of these conversations back outward, back out to the public, so the architect or the designer can be more than just service provider, that can actually be someone who is participating in these conversations to enact deeper change?
Well, I think that it can happen along many registers. I mean, not to advertise the second journal that I
No, go for it.
needed my head examined to start. But Critical Productive is,
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could say we produced two test versions, but we're going to be relaunching pretty soon this year. But with Critical Productive, which is a journal I started in the late in 2010, 2011, the idea was to actually have articles and ideas that could be um, accessible to a broader audience. I mean, I think the first thing is being accessible
Mm-hmm.
to academics outside of architecture, and
Right.
then being accessible to kind of professionals in the discipline, and then being accessible to people outside of either the discipline of architecture or academia. And I think when I look at some of those articles, which some of which are dense and some of which are um, uh, still insular in some ways, but I think the idea of looking at, for example, I'm thinking of an article that Richard Sommer and Glenn Forley did on Highway Beautiful, looking at the 1965 Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March in the context of the Highway Beautiful program that Lyndon Johnson had put forth, national legislation, wanted people to get out and see the countryside, and how the civil rights movement used that public right of way to make the political and visual spectacle that is seared into our memories today. And so the idea of the linkages between national infrastructure, beautification, the aesthetics of landscape, and this very searing struggle for racial and civil rights. Um, Thinking about the work that we published on Lance Wyman, a graphic designer, goes to Mexico City, thinking that he might be there for a weekend, ends up designing the entire logo mark and campaign for the 1968 Olympics. Little did he know he'd be caught up in one of the major protests of that country in the middle of the Olympics, and how his graphic design would be used by the protesters as the background or backdrop for a series of resistant images that would articulate their struggle. And so I think there's a lot to be gained by using the visual arts as a language that can cross over and be understood by the general public. I think today, the conversation's so often about real estate, or not
Mm-hmm.
about real estate. It's about space. It's about the design of buildings. It's about the privatization of space. That's an architectural conversation. It's not
Right.
just a financial conversation with real estate developers. When I look at projects like Hudson Yards and others,
Mm-hmm.
there's robust debate to be had on, what is the nature of public space? What's the nature of private space? How do we want classes and races to connect with one another in communities where we want people to be in dense living situations? We want things to be affordable. And so I think those often come back to architecture after the in quotation grown-ups have made the decisions, where
Right.
I think actually we need to be at the beginning of those conversations, at the origins of those conversations. And I think more architects need to be mayors and uh, urban planners and people involved in government, people involved in real estate. 30 to 40% of our students who go through architecture school today, that's not only USC, but our peer institutions, are not going into traditional practices. And
Mm.
I think partially that's because they're not seeing the ability to make these kind of impacts or to have these kind of conversations in traditional practices. And so
Yeah.
traditional practice has to change and adapt to the generational expectation that your practice in whatever work it's doing is going to deal with these issues. And the other flip side of that is let's celebrate the fact that like law schools and business schools, we're educating people who have the confidence and the intelligence to work across a number of related fields and provide value. So
Right.
I'm okay with that. I sometimes have conversations with alumni here who are professionals who say, "Well, I want architect capital A," and believe me, we have architect capital A seared into the DNA of our school. But that's not mutually exclusive from also saying, I want to be impactful in larger ways, or in working in collaboration with people who are doing public art, or people who are doing public housing, et cetera, et cetera. It's not mutually exclusive. And I think, as you know, the skills that you learn in school in a rigorous way are seared into you. You don't lose those skills. You actually continue to hone those skills given the different career paths that you choose.
I have two more questions to close out the conversation that are perhaps a little more personal, a little more kind of about you and your own work. The first is, you're somebody who has a kind of non-traditional practice at this point. You are an architect. You're also a writer, an editor, an educator, an administrator. I'm interested in how you see, are all those different roles different for you? Do you see that as one kind of design practice, I guess, and then how you kind of think about moving between design, between scholarship, between administration? How does that actually look in your day to day?
Yeah, I think it's a good question to kind of be at. I think no, they're not all the same. I think they all require a slightly different skill set, and I think, but I do think they're complementary of one another. So I think the idea of, maybe I'll go at it through the idea of curation. I think that's a nice nuanced way to think about it. I think as an administrator, I'm a curator ultimately, and I'm trying to, with as light a touch as possible, create, an imprint for the faculty to work within, and to feel like they have agency, but also to feel like there's a higher cause than simply my own course. And it doesn't mean that ideologically there's perfect alignment between what I might think and what they might think, but the idea that I've got to, if not defend, I've got to have robust conversations about different ideologies in play at the school and amongst our peers. I can't simply opt out of that conversation.
Right.
And so I think it's more with the curation, putting forth the idea, for example, citizen architect, as a challenge to think through that lens on how you approach architecture today in your research, in your teaching, and let that form a kind of consistency of conversation that we would uniquely have at the school that perhaps is not being had at other schools. And so I think curation is very important. The same with editing. I think it's, again, to put an imprint, but also to to foreground those issues that I think need to be discussed, and then to try to get people and ideas in conversation with one another, where you feel like something new is being talked about, something new is being, possibilities are emerging. And I think that's a very important key element in all of this. And I think it's probably the thing that connects all of them.
My last question, I'm just curious what you're reading right now.
Well, I was reading, had been working on an essay for the Museum of Modern Art catalog for Black Reconstructions, which opens in early or late February, with thinking about Black architect. There's 10 teams of Black architects working on through the idea of reconstruction. So I was reading the book on reconstructions by the historian Eric Foner.
Right.
So that's one book that I was reading. And I've been reading Matthew Desmond, Evicted, which is actually work about how evictions used to be very rare, and now how they're pretty standard practice. And there's another book I haven't read, but I have it sitting on my desk, is Set the Fire Set the Night on Fire, L.A. in the 60s by Mike Davis and John Wiener. Very interesting book about Los Angeles in the 60s, social movements.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It was really nice to have this conversation and talk a little bit about it with you. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for such insightful questions and really a wonderful conversation, and the work that you're doing, I think, adds to this, to our discipline, and enriches the conversation. So thank you for doing such thoughtful work and having, such a wide range of people that you're bringing.
This episode was recorded on January 20th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.